I had just finished my morning coffee and was heading out the door when I saw the envelope. It was from the Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably just another piece of HOA bureaucratic nonsense, I thought. But as I tore it open and scanned the first few lines, my stomach dropped. The letter was formal, filled with legal-sounding language, and it immediately accused me of violating several code violations, improperly stored trash bins, a fence that was too high, and unapproved landscaping. According to the letter, I had been given enough time to correct these issues, and if I didn't comply immediately, I would face hefty fines and potential legal action. I was taken aback. I had been living in this neighborhood for years, and I took pride in my property. I had never received a single complaint about anything related to my house, especially not anything that could be considered a serious violation. The HOA had always been a bit overzealous in enforcing its rules, but this seemed extreme. The letter even went as far as to threaten arrest, claiming that if I didn't correct the supposed violations, the HOA would have no choice but to escalate matters. Arrest? For what? For a fence that was a couple of inches taller than they preferred. It sounded absurd, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. As a detective, I knew how things worked, and I also knew when someone was trying to pull a fast one. This wasn't just about a few code violations. Someone was trying to flex their authority, and I wasn't about to let that slide. I stood there staring at the letter, a sinking feeling growing in my gut. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was personal. The more I read the letter, the more infuriating it became. The tone was condescending, as though the HOA thought they could simply dictate my every move. But what struck me most was the underlying aggression. It wasn't just a polite reminder to comply with some neighborhood rules. It felt like an ultimatum. The letter mentioned escalating penalties, with veiled threats of legal action and even arrest. Arrest? Over a few minor property issues? I knew the law, and I knew that the HOA didn't have the authority to take such drastic measures. But the threat of arrest, combined with the tone of the letter, made it clear that this wasn't just about the rules. The HOA was wielding its power like a weapon, hoping that I would cave into their demands out of fear. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I had a job to do. As a detective, I wasn't easily intimidated. I had dealt with criminals, with high-pressure situations, and with situations much more complex than a petty HOA complaint. This would be no different. But something about this rubbed me the wrong way. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't the only one who had likely felt the sting of the HOA's overreach. I'd heard whispers from neighbors about the HOA's increasing control, and now I was directly in their sights. I didn't just have to fight this for myself. I had to do it for everyone in the neighborhood who had been bullied by Karen and her crew. But first, I needed to know what I was up against. I wasn't going to take their threats lying down. The first thing I did was gather my legal paperwork, including the property deed, the original HOA documents, and anything that would prove I had every right to the property in question. I knew I needed to be armed with facts and evidence before I made my next move. Karen, the HOA president, had always been a thorn in the side of the neighborhood, but now she had crossed a line. I had no intention of letting her or anyone dictate what I could do with my property. A few days after receiving the letter from the HO, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, I was met with an unfamiliar sight. Two men in uniform standing on my doorstep. Both wore badges and tactical gear that looked like something straight out of a law enforcement unit, complete with utility belts and walkie-talkies. One of them held a clipboard, the other had his hand resting on his hip near what appeared to be a weapon. They both looked like they meant business. "Good afternoon, sir," the man with the clipboard said, his voice too smooth. "We're here to conduct an inspection of your property on behalf of the Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association. There have been several code violations reported, and we need to assess the situation." I narrowed my eyes. Something wasn't right. I didn't recognize either of these men, and they didn't look like the standard HOA enforcement officers I'd seen around the neighborhood in the past. For one, I had never seen the HOA use this kind of force. They typically sent letters or made polite requests for compliance, not show up with men in full tactical gear. "Wait a minute," I said, stepping out onto the porch, not inviting them in, but standing in front of them. "Who are you? And where's your legal documentation?" The man holding the clipboard hesitated for a moment before responding. "We're from the HOA enforcement team. We have full authority to inspect your property and enforce the community's rules. If you don't allow us access, we'll be forced to take further action." I raised an eyebrow. I'm sorry, but I don't believe you. You're not law enforcement, and I've never seen the HOA send anyone like you to intimidate residents. He quickly produced a badge and handed it to me, but something about the badge seemed off. It was too shiny, and it looked more like a prop than something legitimate. I knew better than to be fooled by something that looked hastily put together. Where's your warrant? I asked, voice calm but firm. Because unless you have one, you don't have the right to enter my property or inspect anything. The two men exchanged glances, and I could see them shift uncomfortably. The one holding the clipboard fumbled with his paperwork, clearly unprepared for a pushback. We don't need a warrant. The HOA has given us full permission to enforce these violations. At that moment, the other man stepped forward, and I noticed his hand moving a little too close to his waist, likely reaching for something. I instantly knew that if I didn't assert myself, this could escalate quickly. I'm a detective, I said, my voice taking on a more authoritative tone. And I know the law. You can't just show up with no documentation, no legal standing, and demand access to my property. If you try anything, I'll be calling the sheriff's department. The two men froze, clearly startled by my calm but resolute stance. They hadn't expected me to know what I was talking about. They mumbled something about having orders from the HOA, but knew that they were getting nowhere with me. That's enough, I said, stepping back toward my front door. I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff. You're trespassing, and I'm not going to let you intimidate me or anyone else. Without another word, the two men turned and walked back to their car. I stood at the door, watching them drive away, still not fully processing what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let these so-called HOA police walk all over me. And I was going to make sure that this wasn't the last time they tried to pull a stunt like this. As I watched the fake HOA enforcement officers drive away, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. They weren't law enforcement, but they had been acting like they were. I had dealt with criminals pretending to be something they weren't, but this felt different. These men weren't just impersonating cops. They were part of something much bigger. Something I needed to understand. As a detective, I trained myself to think critically and methodically. My gut told me that the HOA had gone rogue. Karen was trying to push her authority to new, dangerous extremes, but I needed to confirm it. I wasn't going to make any moves without hard evidence. I decided to reach out to a few colleagues who worked in local law enforcement. One of them, Detective Harris, had connections to the sheriff's department, and I knew he'd be able to get me the information I needed. I explained the situation, telling him about the men who had shown up at my door pretending to be HOA officers. They're not real, I told Harris. I know my rights. The HOA can't send officers like that without proper jurisdiction. But they're not backing down. I need to know where they're getting their authority from, or if they're even legally allowed to do what they're doing. Harris was immediately interested. That's a bold move on their part, trying to act like law enforcement. I'll look into it. Give me a couple of hours, and I'll see what I can find out. I spent the next few hours gathering everything I could on the HOA, from the bylaws to the legal documents I had on file when I moved in. I needed to know what kind of legal standing they had, if any, to enforce their rules with such aggression. When Harris called me back, his voice was full of disbelief. I did some digging. You're right. They have no legal standing to send officers out like that. And what's worse, they're not even registered with the county as any kind of enforcement agency. It looks like they've been operating under the radar for months, maybe longer, without anyone questioning them. This was bigger than just one violation. This was an organized effort to intimidate and control homeowners, using fear tactics to enforce HOA rules. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the HOA was using these fake officers to go after homeowners who didn't comply. And I was just their latest target. I'm not going to let this go, I said to Harris. I want to make sure the HOA is held accountable for this. I've had enough of their overreach. After learning the extent of the HOA's illegal tactics, I knew things weren't going to end with just one confrontation. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Karen had orchestrated this entire operation, using fake enforcement officers to bully residents and get them to comply with ridiculous rules. I had to put a stop to it before anyone else got caught in their web of intimidation. But as I was making plans, I got a call from my neighbor Tom. He sounded panicked, his voice shaky as he spoke. Detective, you got to get over here. The same guys who came to your house are here at mine. They've got a tow truck. and they're saying they're going to tow my truck if I don't move it. My heart sank. I immediately grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, heading straight to Tom's house. The anger and frustration from the previous encounter bubbled up inside me again. It wasn't just about the RV anymore. It was about Karen's complete abuse of power, and it needed to stop. When I arrived at Tom's house, I saw the tow truck parked in his driveway and the two men from the previous encounter standing near the truck, arguing with Tom. The fake HOA officers were there, trying to intimidate him into compliance. One of them was holding a clipboard, looking more like a bouncer at a club than a legitimate enforcer of community standards. Tom looked over at me, relief flooding his face as I stepped onto the property. "Detective, these guys are threatening to take my truck unless I comply with their so-called orders. They said I'm in violation of some rule, but they won't even tell me which one." I nodded, walking toward the men. "Hey, gentlemen. I believe we've already had a conversation about your little enforcement tactics," I said, my voice calm but full of authority. "You're not law enforcement, and you have no legal right to be here threatening my neighbor." The man with the clipboard, the one who had been so confident before, now looked uncomfortable. He looked at his partner and then back at me, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Listen," the man said, his voice wavering slightly. "We're just here to do our job. The HOA has given us orders to enforce community codes. If you don't comply, we'll be forced to take action." I held up my phone, ready to record. "I've already told you once that you're trespassing and impersonating law enforcement," I said firmly. "You don't have a right to threaten anyone in this neighborhood, and if you don't leave now, I'm calling the sheriff's department." The fake officers exchanged nervous glances, but neither of them moved. The moment felt tense, like they were weighing their options. It wasn't just that I had caught them, it was that I had the law on my side now. Finally, they turned and walked back toward their truck, muttering under their breath. They knew they couldn't get away with this anymore. "I've got a real officer on the way," I said to Tom. "Let's make sure this doesn't happen again. It's time we put a stop to these guys for good." Tom, still shaken, thanked me. But I could see in his eyes that he knew, like I did, that this situation wasn't over yet. If Karen and her fake enforcement team were willing to go this far, they weren't just going to back off quietly. I had to make sure the HOA knew that their intimidation tactics wouldn't work on me or anyone else in the neighborhood. I wasn't about to let Karen and her fake HOA officers get away with this. The HOA's blatant overreach had crossed the line, and now I needed to take action to make sure they didn't do it again. I wasn't just dealing with a few code violations here. I was dealing with a deliberate attempt to manipulate and intimidate homeowners in the community. I quickly dialed my contact at the sheriff's department, Deputy Harris, the same officer who had helped me with the RV issue. "Harris, I need your help," I said, keeping my voice steady. "There are fake officers from the HO, here again, trying to tow my neighbor's truck. They're impersonating law enforcement, and they've already been warned. I need you to come down here and deal with it before it gets worse." Harris responded immediately. "I'm on my way, Chief. Stay calm and don't let them do anything. I'll bring backup with me." I hung up the phone, turning to Tom. "The real law enforcement is on the way. You don't have to worry anymore." I turned back to the two fake officers, who were now standing by their tow truck, trying to act casual but clearly feeling the heat. They knew they were in trouble, but they hadn't yet realized how much trouble they were actually in. They were about to face real law enforcement, not someone they could intimidate with fake badges and empty threats. A few minutes later, Harris pulled up with a sheriff's cruiser, his lights flashing. He was followed by another deputy and a couple of local officers who had heard about the ongoing harassment. The two fake officers immediately stiffened when they saw the official cars. Their attempt at intimidation had failed, and now they were facing the full weight of the law. Harris stepped out of the car and walked up to the fake officers, his expression all business. "Gentlemen," he said in a tone that brooked no argument, "I'm here to handle the situation now. I'd like you to explain why you're on private property without proper legal authority." The fake officer with the clipboard tried to argue, but his words came out stammering, clearly unprepared for Harris's calm but firm interrogation. We're here on HOA business, enforcing rules. We were given permission to." "No," Harris cut him off. "You're not authorized to impersonate law enforcement, and you certainly don't have the right to threaten someone with arrest or towing for minor violations. You're breaking several laws right now, and I'm not going to let it go any further." The deputy with Harris stepped forward and began taking notes, ready to make a formal report. The fake officers looked at each other, realizing they were out of their depth. The realization dawned on them that they were caught in the act, and there was no way out. Harris turned to me, offering a reassuring nod. "This is over. They'll be heading out of here soon, and I'll make sure their fake enforcement operation is investigated." The two men slowly packed up their gear, trying to save face, but there was no mistaking the embarrassment on their faces. They quickly loaded their things into the tow truck and began to leave. As they drove off, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Karen and her fake enforcement team had been exposed, and the neighborhood was one step closer to being free from their harassment. With the fake officers finally driven off, I felt a sense of relief settle over me. But I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The HOA, led by Karen, was still operating in the shadows, using underhanded tactics to control the neighborhood. I couldn't let this continue. Harris, sensing the urgency, wasn't about to let the matter go either. "I'm filing a report," he said, looking over at me. "These guys are guilty of impersonating law enforcement, and they've been overstepping their bounds for too long. I'm getting the DA involved to make sure they face real consequences. And if the HOA is involved in this, Karen's got some serious explaining to do." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had no doubt Karen was behind this, orchestrating the whole operation from behind the scenes. She'd always had a taste for power, and now she'd pushed things too far. Her actions had threatened not just my property, but the entire community's safety and well-being. We spent the next few hours gathering everything: the evidence of their unlawful behavior, the letter I had received, and photos of the fake badges the officers had shown me. I handed over all the documents to Harris, knowing that we were now setting things in motion to hold Karen and the HOA accountable. By the end of the day, Harris had officially reported the incident to the local district attorney's office. They'd agreed to take action against the fake officers for impersonating law enforcement, and the HOA's illegal tactics were under investigation. The news quickly spread through the neighborhood. People began asking questions, realizing that they had been living under the threat of illegal enforcement for far too long. One by one, residents began stepping forward with their own stories of harassment from the HOA, unjust fines, constant inspections, and threats of property seizures. It became clear to me that Karen's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The community had been quietly suffering under her rule, but now, thanks to everything that had happened, they were ready to fight back. People were reaching out to me for support, asking how they could get involved and make sure the HOA's abuses stopped once and for all. I couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about defending my property. It was about defending everyone in the neighborhood who had been pushed around by Karen and her so-called enforcers. I wasn't going to let them get away with it any longer. It didn't take long for the HOA to respond to the mounting pressure. Within a week, I received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney, claiming that they had been unaware of the actions of the enforcement officers and that they would take immediate action to rectify the situation. The letter also included a veiled threat of legal action against me for defamation and damage to the HOA's reputation. The audacity of it all was almost laughable. They were trying to spin this into something that I had caused, when in fact, it was the HOA's own illegal behavior that had brought the situation to a head. They were clearly trying to intimidate me into silence and make it look like I was the one in the wrong. But I wasn't backing down. I immediately contacted my lawyer, who reviewed the letter and quickly pointed out how weak the HOA's legal position was. "They're trying to throw everything they can at you, but they've got no ground to stand on," my lawyer said. "You got all the documentation and evidence showing that they're the ones who violated the law. We decided to take the offensive." My lawyer wrote a response letter, clearly outlining the illegal actions taken by the HOA, threatening arrest, sending fake officers, and attempting to intimidate me and my neighbors. We included evidence that the HOA was aware of these illegal actions, and we demanded that they cease all further harassment immediately. We also warned them that if they attempted to pursue any legal action against me, we would counter with a lawsuit for harassment and unlawful behavior. While we waited for a response, I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA, and especially Karen, weren't going to just let this go. They had too much invested in maintaining control over the neighborhood. I wasn't just standing up for myself anymore. I was standing up for every resident who had been bullied into silence. But the response that came from the HOA wasn't what I expected. The HOA's lawyers sent a response, but it wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, it was a veiled threat, essentially doubling down on their previous actions. They claimed that I had misinterpreted their enforcement tactics and that the HOA was within its rights to maintain community standards. They also hinted at legal action if I continued to spread what they called false information about their authority. It was clear that they weren't going to back down without a fight. But what the HOA didn't realize was that they had just set the stage for a much bigger confrontation. When I received the letter, I knew it was time to escalate things further. I wasn't about to let Karen and the HOA off the hook with a few legal threats. I had legal recourse, but I also had the real law on my side. I immediately called Deputy Harris to update him on the situation and explained that the HOA was now threatening legal action. He was not surprised. "This is exactly what I expected, Chief. We've got to put the pressure on them legally and show them that they can't get away with what they've been doing. The Sheriff's Department will back you up in any way we can." But it wasn't just about sending a letter anymore. I knew the HOA would only take this seriously if they saw the full weight of law enforcement behind the community's fight for fairness. So I decided to reach out to the district attorney's office. I scheduled a meeting with the DA, explaining the situation in detail and providing all the evidence of the HOA's overreach. We discussed the implications of what had happened, the illegal actions, the fake officers, and how Karen had used her position to harass and intimidate the neighborhood. It became clear that this was more than just a small issue with a few code violations. The HOA was operating outside the law, and the DA's office agreed that it needed to be investigated further. Within a few days, the district attorney's office announced that they would be looking into the HOA's practices. Karen's reign of terror was about to come to an end. As I stood there talking with the DA, I felt a rush of vindication. It was one thing to fight for what was right, but now the law was on our side. This wasn't just about me, it was about every homeowner who had suffered under Karen's heavy-handed tactics. The wheels of justice were starting to turn, and they weren't stopping until the HOA was held accountable for their actions. It didn't take long for the district attorney's office to start making waves. As soon as the DA's investigation into the HOA went public, Karen's entire strategy began to unravel. She had always relied on fear and intimidation, but now she was facing real legal consequences for her actions. The first sign that things were shifting came when I received a call from the HOA's lawyer, asking to meet in person. It was clear from the way he spoke that they were no longer as confident as they had been a few weeks ago. "We'd like to discuss a resolution," he said. "The HOA is willing to settle and avoid further legal proceedings. We'd prefer to keep this matter out of the public eye." I agreed to meet with him, knowing that this could be the turning point. I wasn't about to let Karen or the HOA get away with their actions without ensuring that this didn't happen again. It was time to make them understand the full weight of the consequences. When I arrived at the meeting, the atmosphere was tense. The lawyer was there, along with a few HOA board members who looked nervous. They weren't used to being challenged like this. They had always thought of themselves as the final authority in the neighborhood, and now they were scrambling to save face. "We understand that the HOA may have overstepped its bounds," the lawyer started, avoiding eye contact, "and we're prepared to settle the matter without any further litigation. The HOA will issue a formal apology and commit to reviewing its enforcement policies." Karen was sitting at the back of the room, her arms crossed, looking like she was about to explode. She didn't like losing control, especially in front of a group. I could tell she was furious, but there was nothing she could do now. The situation had spiraled beyond her control. "The apology is a start," I said, maintaining a calm but firm tone. "But it's not enough. This behavior has been going on for far too long. The HOA will need to implement real, transparent changes. You will be required to offer restitution to residents who have been harassed and wrongfully fined. And I will be working with the Sheriff's Department and the DA to ensure that no more illegal activities take place under your watch." Karen's face turned red with anger, but she couldn't say a word. The weight of the law had caught up to her, and she knew she had no choice but to back down. Over the next few weeks, the HOA issued a formal apology to the community, acknowledging their wrongdoings and committing to transparency and fairness in their enforcement policies. They also agreed to provide restitution to the homeowners who had been unjustly fined or harassed. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, and the board was restructured with new members who were dedicated to improving the neighborhood, not controlling it. The victory wasn't just mine, it was a collective win for the entire neighborhood. People who had been too afraid to speak out now found their voices. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed, and it felt like we were all finally free from the shadow of Karen's reign. With Karen and her overbearing HOA practices gone, the community began to heal. The changes were noticeable almost immediately. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down, afraid of retaliation from the HOA, began to speak up at the newly reformed meetings. It was like the floodgates had opened. I took it upon myself to be part of the rebuilding process. As a detective, I had dealt with plenty of complex investigations, but this was different. This was about restoring trust in the community and making sure everyone felt safe and respected in their own homes. The first step was making sure the HOA's new leadership was held accountable for the promises they made. The new board members were open to suggestions and willing to listen. We organized a series of town hall meetings where residents could bring up any concerns they had. It felt like the neighborhood had been given a voice again, no longer under the shadow of someone like Karen who ruled with fear and threats. During one of the meetings, Mr. Thompson, one of my neighbors, stood up and thanked me. "I never thought I'd see the day when the HOA would actually listen to us," he said. "I've lived here for 15 years, and I was too scared to say anything. But now I feel like we have a real chance to make things better." It was moments like that that reminded me why I had stood up to the HOA in the first place. It wasn't just about protecting my property or taking down one power-hungry person. It was about creating a neighborhood where everyone could live freely, without fear of arbitrary rules or intimidation. We also worked with the sheriff's department to ensure that the new HOA enforcement system was legally sound. No more fake officers, no more unlawful threats. We even set up a community patrol group, not to enforce HOA rules, but to ensure safety and look out for each other. The neighborhood had become a community in the true sense of the word, and I was proud to be a part of it.